Greetings loyal subscribers and honoured guests. A couple of years ago now I reviewed the original Ty the Tasmanian Tiger as part of the 2015 Summer Backlog Challenge. While I would most definitely place it behind the A-tier platformers such as Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank and Sly Cooper, it is still far ahead of trash like Vex and Dr. Muto. I would say it's pretty close to something like Ape Escape 2 in terms of overall quality. A little rough around the edges, but still extremely playable and well worth seeking out for the few quid it will cost you nowadays. Now, I also picked up the sequel at around the same time I found the first game, and I've been wanting to play it ever since I finished the original, so I recently completed it. Today we're going to find out how it stacks up to the first game, and if I can recommend that you play it yourself. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 2 Bush Rescue takes place sometime after the events of the original and sees Ty and his mates at the opening ceremony to the newly constructed RMGB Bush Rescue. The outback is a dangerous place with many hazards including fires, dangerous animals and hazardous terrain, so there's always someone in need of help. While this is all going on though, Fluffy, who was briefly in the first game and is one of Boss Cass's henchmen, is attempting to break the evil cassowary out of prison. Ty has to drop what he's doing and rush over there in his brand new Bunyip mech suit, taking out hordes of frill lizards along the way. You are plunged into the first proper mission of the game very quickly after this, and it's quite an entertaining start. After getting to the prison you will have to man a gun turret and attempt to fend off waves of dropships and giant enemy robots. This is actually surprisingly difficult. I failed it the first time. When you get used to where the enemies are going to spawn from though and realise that the mechs die quickly if you target their heads, it's not so bad. Of course, Boss Cass does end up escaping and becomes the main antagonist once again. You can't just go after him though because of some nonsense about him creating his own country and having diplomatic immunity. After this you will have to carry out 5 or so missions for Bush Rescue before the next main story mission unlocks, which is a pattern that is repeated 4 or so times before the game comes to an end. The game is not going to win any awards for amazing storytelling, but it's perfectly fine for a cartoony platformer. The first game in the series had some really great music composed by Stamadiadis, and he has returned for the sequel. The themes from the original are reprised here in various different forms and still sound great. Some of the new compositions are not quite so good, I would have to say. Overall the quality is still extremely decent. All of the voice actors from the first game are also back, and they do a great job of sounding authentically Australian, probably because they are, I would guess. A lot of the lines that have been given to them are extremely cliched, but as the whole game is pretty much a caricature of Australian life and culture, that's only to be expected.
And it is with great pride that I cut this ribbon and officially declare open RMGB Bush Rescue! It's a state-of-the-art facility with an observation tower, research lab, airstrip, and advanced headquarters.
That's you, Possum!
Good on ya, mate. Dennis, you won't regret this. With Bush Rescue, we're ready to take on Boss Cass the next time he strikes.
The visuals of Ty 2 are pretty much on par with those of the originals, if not ever so slightly better I would say. Ty still has that weird grin on his face, but they're not going to change an established look now, are they? So I suppose we better get used to it. The design of the various Bunyip mechs is cool and they all look suitably shiny as well. For the most part the game engine manages to keep up with the action that's going on. There's very little slowdown in evidence. Visually the game still lags behind the big boys of the genre though, Jak and Daxter etc. I know I keep mentioning Jak and Daxter throughout this review, but it is a pretty fair comparison really, where the first game was pretty much a straight and pure platformer with a focus on various collectibles. This time around the game has shifted somewhat into an action game. While you aren't given guns like in Jak 2, you are given a whole range of different boomerangs and vehicles that allow you to access different parts of the world. And there's much more focus on mini-games such as flying a helicopter to save people, fix bridges or put out fires for example. I really enjoyed these helicopter sections personally, though I know not everyone does. They are quite brief and not too challenging, so I thought they made a nice change from the standard gameplay. There's also a few submarine stages that control in almost exactly the same way. What I wasn't quite so keen on is this game's version of the open world. After you've got past the opening section of the game and are working for bush rescue, you can venture out in your 4B Jeep. Dotted around the map are various levels that you can visit, with stars of various colours denoting where there are missions to be carried out. My issue is that the world is pretty big and you will have to do a ton of backtracking throughout the game. You'll be collecting opals absolutely everywhere you go, and will need to return to the hub at Barramudgee in order to buy new rangs and bunyips. But every time you go back, you then have to trudge all the way back to the 4B again. Each section of the world is segmented off by a door that takes an age to open because the game is loading the world behind it, and there's 2 or 3 of these doors between you and the open world, so it does feel excruciatingly slow at times. Other than this though, I can say that I enjoyed Ty the Tasmanian 2 just as much as the original. There are still a ton of collectible items to be found scattered throughout the world in this one, such as silver cogs and bilbies, but this time they are entirely optional. The only thing that you get out of finding all of them is a 100% completion rate and a 30-second teaser for Ty 3 that you can just look up on YouTube these days anyway. It's really not worth all the extra hours of playtime unless you really enjoy the game. Chrome Studios have even tried to cram a whole kart racing game in here, but unfortunately it's not particularly good. It moves at a nice pace, but the controls are frustrating and the AI cheats like a bastard. They would have been better off leaving it out, to be honest. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 2 doesn't bring in anything new to the genre at all, but it was never trying to. The different vehicles such as the 4B helicopter, submarine and bunyips all handle well and do a good job of adding variety to the game. Ty 2 is a pretty short game if you don't try and get 100% completion. I was enjoying the game, completing all the missions, and I had assumed I still had another batch to go, when I suddenly found myself on the final mission and completing the game. That was after about 6 to 7 hours of playtime, which isn't terrible considering that I picked the game up for £2.50, but I was still left wanting more. Luckily there's a third game in the series which I will definitely be checking out in the future. If you were to try and find every last collectible in the game, that would take quite a bit more extra time, but you do get very little from doing so. All things considered, I would say that Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 2 is just as enjoyable as the first game in the series. The gameplay has changed quite a bit with a lot less emphasis on platforming, but Chrome still have a solid foundation on which to build a fun series. From what I've heard about Ty 3, they change things up even more, and not in a good way. I'll be finding out for myself in a bit, but in the meantime I would definitely say it's worth playing the second game in the trilogy. Since I made my review of Ty 1, the first 2 games have been released on Steam at about £10 each. That's a pretty steep price compared to what you're likely to pay for the PS2 version, but they have improved the graphics, tweaked the camera, and fixed some bugs, so you're probably getting a slightly nicer experience. Whichever way you play these games though, they are still worth a few hours of your time. See you next week for another video. In the meantime, take care.